My mother kicked me out of the house after my father's funeral to give my room to her stepchildren, but she found out I was the heir to the house and now she has to beg me for permission to stay. I don't even know how to put into words the feeling of being treated like a stranger by your own mother on the day you're burying your father. It's like the weight of the world wasn't heavy enough, and someone decided to sprinkle it with thorns. My father's funeral, meant to be a solemn goodbye to the man who held our family together, turned into a stage for my mother's selfish spectacle. It wasn't about him. It was about her new beginnings, her new family, and her so-called fresh start. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My father had been the backbone of our family, a kind, patient man who somehow always managed to fix everything, even when my mother seemed intent on breaking it. And there she was, standing beside the stepkids she brought into the marriage from her second failed attempt at happiness, treating them like they were the center of her universe. Me, I was a shadow in the corner, someone barely worth acknowledging. Not a word of comfort.
No.
Nothing. Just a forced, cold greeting that felt more like an obligation than genuine concern. The tension in the room was palpable, but not in the way you'd expect at a funeral. Guests whispered among themselves, probably noticing the same thing I did. How my mother barely mentioned my father in her so-called tribute. Instead, she rambled about the new beginnings awaiting the family. It hit me like a ton of bricks. She'd been planning this. My father had been sick for years, and while I was busy caring for him, she'd been quietly crafting her escape plan, laying the groundwork for her new life. But I wasn't prepared for how quickly she'd make her true intentions clear. As the funeral wrapped up and the guests began to leave, I decided to approach her. Not to argue, but to seek a moment of connection. Something to assure me that, despite everything, we were still family. What I got instead was a look of impatience and a few words that cut deeper than any knife. Now that this is over, I expect you to start looking for somewhere else to live. The kids need the space, and you're old enough to take care of yourself. Space. Take care of myself? Seriously, this was my home. The house I grew up in. The place where I spent countless nights caring for my father while she barely showed up to check if everything was okay. And now, because her new kids needed more rooms, I was the one being kicked out. The way she said it left no room for argument. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. My own mother was evicting me from the family home on the same day we buried my father. And the worst part? She said it as if it was the most reasonable thing in the world. That night, as I packed up my things in a daze, I couldn't stop replaying her words in my head. How had we come to this? All the sacrifices I made for this family, the sleepless nights, the care I gave my father when no one else would, and now this. I was filled with anger, sadness, and a hollow feeling I couldn't quite describe. I didn't know what I was going to do, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let them walk all over me without a fight. I just didn't know how I'd even begin to face something so monumental. What was supposed to be a day of closure and mourning for my father turned into the opening chapter of a battle I never imagined I'd have to fight. A fight for my place in the family, my dignity, and my right to exist in the home my father and I had built together. The next morning didn't feel like any ordinary day. It was as if reality had shifted overnight, and the ground beneath me was no longer solid. I had no plan, no clear place to go, but one thing was certain. My time in that house was up. My mother had left no room for doubt. As I began to pack the first boxes of my belongings, the weight of the situation hit me harder than I expected. Descending the stairs, I was met with a scene that shattered what was left of my composure. There she was, my mother, sitting at the dining table, laughing with her new children. They had taken over what was once a shared space of memories with my father and twisted it into something unrecognizable. My seat at the table was now occupied by one of them. The remnants of my past life were being erased before my eyes, replaced with this distorted version of what my mother now considered her family. I tried to speak to her, not to plead for my place but to understand. How could she cast me aside so easily? How could she treat me like a stranger, like an intruder in my own home? But when I approached her, her response was colder than I could have imagined. "What are you still doing here? I thought we talked about this yesterday. You need to start packing." "I don't want any drama," she said. not even bothering to look up from her cup of coffee. The iciness in her voice left me frozen for a moment. This wasn't the woman who used to comfort me as a child, who held me when I was scared, who promised everything would be okay when my father fell ill. She was unrecognizable, and that hurt more than anything else. But the worst was yet to come. As I continued packing, I overheard a conversation in the living room that wasn't meant for my ears. One of the new children asked her a question that stopped me in my tracks. "Are you sure we can stay here? I mean, wasn't this house his?" My mother's response filled in all the missing pieces of the puzzle. "This house is mine now. We discussed it before he passed. Everything's under control." Under control. That phrase echoed in my head as I tried to process what I just heard. The house, the one my father and I had worked so hard to maintain, was the last remaining symbol of our family. And now she was treating it like a trophy, something to dole out as she pleased. The anger that surged through me in that moment was indescribable. I couldn't let this be the end of it. I couldn't let them get away with this. I decided to do something I never thought I'd have to. I went searching for the house's legal documents. My father had always been meticulous, and he used to say everything was in order, just in case. There had to be something that would explain how we got here. That night, when the house was quiet, I searched through every drawer, every folder, looking for answers. And then I found it. Among my father's final papers, there it was, the detail that changed everything. The house wasn't my mother's. It had never been hers. It was mine. My father had left it to me, ensuring I would always have a place to call home, no matter what. The realization hit me like a tidal wave, a mixture of relief and devastation. Relief because I had leverage. Devastation because my mother knew this and had chosen to ignore it. She had chosen to throw me out of something that legally belonged to me. At that moment, I understood it wasn't just about the house. It was about my worth, my place in this fractured family. My mother had made a decision that went beyond betrayal. She had shown me, in no uncertain terms, that I didn't matter to her. But if she thought I was going to accept this without a fight, she was gravely mistaken. Discovering that my father had left the house in my name sent me into a whirlwind of emotions. For hours, I sat in my room, staring at that document over and over, trying to process its significance. My mother knew. She had known all along. Yet, she chose to ignore it, to act as if it didn't exist, as if I didn't exist. Every corner of that house held memories of my father, of the laughter and tears we shared. It wasn't just a building. It was our home. The thought of it being turned into a playground for her stepchildren made my stomach churn. I couldn't sit idly by while she stripped it of everything it represented. It was time to confront her. I couldn't keep silent any longer. That very night, when the house was quiet and her new kids were in their rooms, I marched downstairs with the document in hand. She was sitting on the couch, watching some TV show as if nothing was wrong. I walked up with purpose and planted myself in front of her. "Does this look normal to you?" I asked bluntly, shoving the paper in her face. She glanced up, clearly irritated by my interruption. But when her eyes landed on the header of the document, her expression changed. First, there was surprise, followed by a mix of discomfort and annoyance. "Where did you find that?" she asked, trying to keep her composure. "Is that all you have to say?" I replied, disbelief dripping from my voice. "You knew this house belonged to me. Dad left it to me. Yet you threw me out like I was some stranger. What kind of person does that?" Her gaze hardened. There was something in her eyes I hadn't seen before, a resentment that she had clearly been suppressing. "You don't understand anything," she said coldly. "I've done all of this for us. The family changed, and this house needs to work for everyone." I laughed, but it wasn't out of humor. It was bitter, incredulous. "Us? Family?" I shot back, pointing toward the upstairs rooms where her new favorites were sleeping. "Don't make me laugh. This isn't about family. This is about you. It's always been about you. Ever since Dad died, all you've cared about is building this fantasy life with your new husband and his kids, as if that could erase the past." My mother stood up from the couch, clearly offended, raising her voice. "Don't talk about things you don't understand," she yelled. "You have no idea how hard it's been for me. Your father left me nothing but problems, and I've had to carry it all while you lived your life without a care in the world." Her words hit me like a slap in the face. Problems? That's how she described everything my father had worked for? Problems, I repeated, unable to believe what I was hearing. Dad worked his entire life for this house, for this family. And now you want to turn it into some kind of hotel for your stepkids? That's your gratitude? That's your loyalty? The argument escalated into chaos. Her defenses grew weaker, her excuses more transparent. Finally, when she realized she couldn't justify her actions, she tried a different tactic. "Fine," she said, her tone laced with bitterness. "Legally, the house is yours. But what are you going to do? Throw me out? Leave me on the street?" That question left me momentarily speechless. I had imagined confronting her, exposing her hypocrisy, but I hadn't thought about what would come next. Her attempt at emotional manipulation was clear, but I couldn't ignore what she had done. This house was mine, but at what cost? Could I truly make her my enemy for good? Finally, with my heart heavy and my mind racing, I decided I wouldn't let her guilt trip me into submission. "That depends on you," I said, staring her straight in the eye. "This house isn't yours. If you want to stay, it'll be under my terms. I won't tolerate you erasing Dad's memory from this place or pretending I don't exist anymore." She didn't respond that night. She stood there in the living room, her face a mix of defeat and suppressed anger. She knew she had lost the battle, but she also wasn't the type to surrender easily. As I climbed back to my room that night, I realized this war was far from over. The days following that confrontation felt like walking through a minefield. The tension in the house was so thick you could cut it with a knife. My mother, far from admitting her mistakes or trying to make amends, began orchestrating her own silent counterattack. She didn't say it outright, but her actions screamed louder than any words ever could. It started with small, seemingly insignificant things. My clothes, which had always been neatly folded in my drawers, began disappearing. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe I misplaced something. But one night, I found a bag with some of my favorite shirts stuffed in the garbage bin in the garage. Couldn't believe it. Next, it was the food. Growing up, the pantry was always stocked with the essentials, thanks to my father's meticulous planning. But now, every time I opened the fridge or the pantry, the items I used to buy and enjoy were mysteriously gone. Instead, the shelves were full of snacks and drinks that her stepchildren liked. It was as though I was being erased, not just emotionally but physically, from the house. The attitude of my new siblings was the final straw. Her stepchildren, who until now had barely acknowledged me, began treating me with blatant disrespect. One night, one of them barged into my room without knocking. Pointing at my desk, he casually said, "Mom says I should have this room because it's bigger and I need more space for my gaming setup." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. But what infuriated me the most was seeing my mother sitting in the living room, listening as they argued over how to rearrange the house to better suit their needs. Like I wasn't even there. And she, instead of correcting them or reminding them that the house was mine, just nodded or stayed silent. That silence was louder than any shout. It was her way of telling me, without words, that I no longer belonged there. I realized she was testing me, pushing me to see how much I could take before I snapped. But I refused to give her that satisfaction. Reacting impulsively would mean falling into her trap, and I wasn't about to let that happen. If she wanted to drive me out of my own home, she'd have to try much harder. So I dug in. I locked my room and installed a second padlock for good measure. I set up cameras in common areas, not just to protect my belongings, but to document any attempts to sabotage me. If she or her stepchildren wanted to make my life hell, I'd have the evidence to prove it. But I wasn't just on the defensive. I started making it clear that I wasn't going anywhere. At the family gatherings my mother loved to host, always eager to show off her perfect family, I made a point of showing up and taking a prominent place at the table. My presence clearly made her uncomfortable, but she couldn't tell me to leave without exposing herself as the villain. During one such gathering, my late father's uncle, an older man who had always been close to us, asked me in front of everyone, "So, how's managing the house going? Must be a lot to handle on your own." My mother's face froze. She couldn't outright lie in front of the whole family, so she forced a tight smile and muttered, "Well, we're working together to adjust." That small victory fueled me. It was a reminder that while my mother was relentless, she wasn't invincible. Yet it also reinforced the reality that she wasn't going to give up. If anything, she seemed more determined than ever to take control. It hurt, a deep, raw pain, to be at odds with the person who was supposed to be my greatest supporter. But I refused to let her strip away what my father had worked so hard to build. This house was my legacy, my home, and I wasn't going to let it go. No matter how far this battle had to go, I was prepared to fight. By this point, it was clear my mother wasn't going to stop. What had started as passive-aggressive acts had evolved into a full-blown strategy. She wasn't just trying to make me uncomfortable in my own home. She was actively working to discredit me in front of anyone who might support my right to stay. But if she thought I was going to back down, she was dead wrong. One afternoon, while combing through some legal papers related to the inheritance at the library, I stumbled upon something that changed everything. A detailed document where my father had explicitly outlined what should happen to the house if he passed away. In it, he clearly stated the property was to be transferred into my name. But what struck me the most was a clause I'd overlooked before. If anyone tried to contest this decision, their share of the inheritance would be immediately revoked. It was an ace up my sleeve I hadn't realized I had, but it couldn't have surfaced at a better time. Armed with this newfound leverage, I decided to change my approach. For weeks, I'd been playing defense, blocking my mother's attempts at sabotage, but now it was time to go on the offensive. I wasn't going to be rude or aggressive, but I would make it crystal clear I wasn't the naive son she thought she could manipulate. I began attending family gatherings with a newfound confidence. I openly discussed my plans to renovate the house, emphasizing how I wanted to preserve my father's legacy. Of course, this triggered looks of confusion and tension from my mother, who would try to derail the conversation with awkward laughs or irrelevant comments. I pressed on, ignoring her attempts to shift the focus. During one of these gatherings, a distant cousin asked a question that brought a thick tension to the room. "So, is your mother supporting you with all this? It must be tough handling it on your own." From across the table, my mother shot me a glare sharp enough to cut steel. Smiling, I replied calmly, "Not exactly, but I've always been independent. It's nothing new for me." Murmurs filled the room, and the discomfort on my mother's face was impossible to miss. Meanwhile, the sabotage at home escalated. One morning, I discovered water running in the basement, causing a minor flood that damaged some of my father's antique furniture. Another night, I heard footsteps outside my room and found my mother's stepchildren trying to jimmy open my door with a knife. Rather than confronting them, I recorded the whole thing on video. It wasn't just about protecting my space anymore. I was gathering evidence. But the real turning point came when I walked into the study and found my mother and her stepchildren rifling through my desk. One of them was even taking pictures of the documents. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice firmer than I expected. My mother froze, while one of the stepchildren stammered a pathetic excuse about looking for a pen. "This stops now," I said, snatching the papers from their hands. "I've tried to be patient, but this crosses the line." Instead of apologizing, my mother accused me of being selfish, of refusing to share what rightfully belonged to everyone. That's when I knew it was time to lay all my cards on the table. With a steady voice, I explained what I'd found in my father's will. The clause that nullified anyone's inheritance if they attempted to contest the property. I made it clear that if they continued with this behavior, they wouldn't just lose any chance of staying in the house. They'd face legal consequences. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother didn't say a word, but her eyes betrayed a mix of fury and fear. The stepchildren, on the other hand, tried to downplay the situation with clumsy excuses, but it was too late. They'd lost any leverage they thought they had. That night, for the first time in what felt like ages, I slept peacefully. I knew the game wasn't over yet, but for the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand, and I was ready for whatever came next. When I woke up that morning, something in the air felt different. It was as if the fragile balance in the house was about to shatter. I didn't know how or when, but I was certain that the final showdown with my mother and her stepchildren was imminent. And I was right. Since the confrontation in the study, my mother had been walking on thin ice. On one hand, she was trying to regain some control. On the other, she knew any misstep could cost her everything. Her attitude had shifted, not for the better. She went from direct attacks to a silent, seething disdain that was impossible to ignore. Instead of confronting me outright, she started using her stepchildren as her proxies. One day, while I was in the kitchen making something to eat, I overheard a conversation in the living room. One of her stepchildren was whining to her, "This isn't fair, Mom. He's living like a king in that big room while we're all crammed into what's left." My mother's tone was meant to be reassuring, but it couldn't hide her irritation. "Don't worry, this won't last long. I've got something in the works." It wasn't hard to guess that her something involved yet another underhanded scheme. But honestly, I didn't care anymore. It was time to take definitive control of the situation. I decided to call a family meeting. This wasn't going to be a friendly chat or an attempt at reconciliation. This was an intervention to lay everything bare and put an end to the toxicity that had taken over the house since my mother decided I was expendable. That evening, I gathered everyone in the main living room. My mother sat at the back, arms crossed, wearing an expression that was equal parts disdain and curiosity. Her stepchildren, undoubtedly prepped by her, looked at me with a mix of defiance and unease. I stood firm, documents in hand, with a resolve I had never felt before. "I think it's time we put everything on the table," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've tried to be patient, to handle things respectfully, but that hasn't worked. So here we are." I proceeded to read key sections of my father's will, making sure every word resonated in the tense silence of the room. My voice was firm, but the emotional weight behind my words was impossible to conceal. I wasn't just speaking as the rightful owner of the house. I was speaking as someone who had been betrayed by the one person who was supposed to protect me. My father made it clear that this house is mine, not because he wanted to exclude anyone, but because he knew I would care for it the way he would have wanted. "But what I won't tolerate is being treated like an intruder in my own home." There was a moment of stunned silence after my words. My mother tried to interrupt, muttering something about how my father didn't understand the situation when he wrote the will. But I cut her off, my tone sharper than I expected. "No, Mom, it's not him who didn't understand the situation. It's you." I took a deep breath before continuing. "I know you've been trying to manipulate everything from the start. The incidents, the lies, the attempts to undermine me, but I won't tolerate it anymore. If this keeps up, I'll have no choice but to take legal action. And believe me, I'm not afraid to do it." The reaction was explosive. The stepchildren started shouting, accusing me of being selfish and trying to leave them with nothing. My mother, in a last-ditch effort to gain sympathy, began crying and claiming she only wanted what was best for everyone. But this time, her tears didn't work. Not on me, and certainly not on the few extended family members present as witnesses. When the chaos finally subsided, I made my final declaration. "This is my house, but I'm not a tyrant. I'm giving you 2 weeks to find somewhere else to live. After that, I need you out. I can't live in this toxic dynamic anymore, and I won't." 2 weeks later, the house was quiet for the first time in years. The stepchildren had moved out, though not without trying to take a few things that didn't belong to them. My mother, defeated, asked for permission to stay in a small guest room while she figured out her next steps. I agreed, but with clear conditions. No more games, no more lies, and no more manipulation. If she broke those rules, I wouldn't hesitate to make her leave too. In the months that followed, the house finally began to feel like a home again. I regained control of my life, my memories, and most importantly, my peace of mind. My mother, while still distant, started to show signs of genuine remorse. It might have been too late to fully repair our relationship, but at least there was a mutual understanding. I was no longer the easily manipulated child she once knew. I had learned to stand up for myself, and that had changed everything for me.